Gentlemen, and finally we are at the last session, which is going to be a QA session, where throughout the day, after lunch of course, we had a couple of speakers coming up and presenting their ideas, their thoughts, and we somehow have got a few questions from the audience, and we will be taking up all the questions. For this QA sessions, we have a moderator. Please help me welcome on stage onto the dais a moderator for this QA session, Dr. Jairam. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. I would also request him to kindly introduce once again all our speakers to all of you. Thank you, sir.
Thanks. Oops. Thank you. I think you all have met the speakers. I don't need to reintroduce them. So if all of you could come up, Julie, Dr. Bernstein, Shereen, Dr. Sufi. Shalini has had to leave because her flight is at 7. So I will ask someone who is no less an expert, but she will claim she is not. Mrs. Anisha Ghoshal, she has also been instrumental in, educating a lot of people in Eastern India about fragile eggs. So Anisha, we have managed to bully her and bring her into stage. So... Thank you. So I have given the questions to, did I give you the question to some of you? No? Okay. So basically the format is, that all of you have had asked some questions through the app. But let us begin with, are there any questions from the floor? And then we will take the questions which has been sent through the app. So are there any questions which you want to shoot right away, or do we? No. Okay, yeah. Can you please introduce yourself and then...
Hello everybody, my name is Ishita Mohankar. I have a 10-year-old son, a boy who's been attending Amrit Somani Memorial Center for the last, I think, 5.5 years. I would like to know more about this letter board. This is the first time that I've heard about it, and I would want to know what it is and how do we get our children with it, working on it.
Excellent, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm so glad that you asked. So, yes. Where do you start? So it's a process, right? It takes time. And I think that having proper support for parents and for professionals is so important. And in my journey of learning, it was really hard. And also, there's that mentality of these rules, right? That all these programs have, and I am not a rule follower. So I went and I learned different programs, I learned the rules, and then I let go of the rules. And now I've put my own stamp on it and creating my own version that has more freedom in it. So there's many different approaches, and I think it's important to find what resonates with you. Some people love those rules, and that really works really well for them. So I would recommend looking at, there's Soma is amazing. She does a rapid prompting method. There's Elizabeth. She does spelling to communicate. And then if you go to autisticallyinclined.com/India, I am offering a 6-month course online just to you guys and giving you step-by-step, very small steps to make it doable. It can feel really overwhelming, and I want to make sure that it's done in a way that feels relaxed and at ease, and so I will be there for 6 months to help hold your hand and walk you through every step.
Thank you. Yeah, Kavita?
As a follow-up, is literacy a prerequisite to use the letter board?
Great question. What we find is a lot of times, I've again, they can't show us all that they know, but they're taking it all in. And so through the methodology, we are teaching them how to read. How in the, I'll teach them something age appropriate and take the key word and spell it for them so they can see it and they can hear it, and then ask them to spell it. So if they don't know, I'm right there to help. But a lot of times they taught themselves to read. If they're 7 or 8, they usually know a lot more than they realize.
Thank you.
It's not a prereq though.
Anything else? Yeah, no. I just wanted to,
I'm Ajay and I work in neuroscience. My question though was more to do with, I heard Dr. Bernstein speak in terms of very specific intervention for each child. So my question is, how do we scale this? So the IAC is a great initiative for a few people to benefit a lot, and I suppose the little board is for more people getting inputs there. But how can a lot of people get familiar with the techniques, get more conversant, so that they can also help in some sense to facilitate the child's development? That's what I was thinking.
I love that question because people look at my work and say, well, it's your relationship with the child, and how does everybody else do it? And what I'd like to do, and I haven't done it yet, and I was hoping maybe this program would spur this, to have thank you for the lights, to have a training program. Now I've done this in small groups, to have a training program for teachers, for therapists, anyone, even for parents, to train them with a certain group of people, to pass on the evaluation and treatment that I've developed. So I think that's the question I'm dealing with myself. Like Mr. Samani said, I'm not going to live forever, and I want this, whatever it is that I have, or that we have together, to continue. So I'm just at the very beginning of developing a 6-step program of teaching using videotapes. I put that videotape on the board because what I've been hearing here, more than anything else, that these kids in school, in the ASMC school, a lot of them are echolalic. In other words, they repeat and repeat and repeat. And after my last talk, a group of parents were asking me about this, so I dug this slide up of a girl who's echolalic and what I needed to do to break that echolalic. So I would have, to answer your question, I would have slides like this, stop it, and say, is that language? Is that real language, or is it just repetitive? So, I mean, we could play that or not. I wanted to have it up there just in case we wanted to go through that learning process. It's a teaching tape. I cut it to teach people. And so I would go through this 6-step process, including tapes and an interactive way of working with people.
Dr. Bernstein, maybe once we have had the first round of questions, we can go back to the tape and then you can take us through it. Yeah.
Sure, I'd love to.
Yeah. At the back, yeah.
Hello. The question is for the last...
Can you introduce? Yeah,
I'm Neetu. I'm a parent of an autistic child who is 12 years old. So the question is directed to the last speaker. Thank you for your presentation where you connected the fascinating world of oral movements, feeding and speech together. So my question was for a parent, a layman who does not really know anything about that. So is there any resources online where we can combine the food combination? You said you have to work with taste, texture and all that. So is there any combinations of food, recipes or something that a parent can really get resources, like how to combine food?
Well, you can take talktools.com has all the courses online that you can take as a parent to understand. They also bring the courses to India now. There is a feeding program that's part of their course. So if feeding, it depends on what your priority is. If feeding is an issue, then I would suggest maybe looking at that a little bit more. But if you think speech is more of an issue, then you would look at that. But there are these courses online which you get access to for a whole year. And you can always go back to it, you get a login and you can keep doing it. And a lot of the additional courses I do online and it's good. So if you think that's something, talktools.com has a whole set of it, yeah.
Hello everyone, myself Auditor. I have a kid, 3 years old, he is autistic. So my question is that generally to develop the social skill, like we always talk that he should play with the same age peer or typically developed child. But the problem is like when a typically developed child is trying to play with my kid, if my kid is not giving a response to them, then the child is not playing after 2 or 3 days. Then he will play alone. So how to address this kind of scenario? Like how can I engage my child to play with the typically developed kid or any peer?
Could you repeat the question?
Who is this one for?
I think it's basically the question is that how do you encourage a child who has got autism to play with a typically developing child who may not be, the social reciprocity is a problem. So therefore, how do you engage the other child to play? Is that, yeah.
That is, you hit upon what I consider maybe the most important thing with these autistic kids, and that is relating, establishing friendships. And I developed what I called, before the word integration came about, this was in the 70s, what I called an integration, I called a visiting program with a typical nursery school with young autistic kids. And to have these kids integrate and like and appreciate, now this is something that I know you know is true, that it's just as good for the typical kids to know the autistic kids as the autistic kids to relate to them. It works both ways. It's just as amazing for both of them to understand each other. So it has to be done in a methodical way. The kids who are autistic may not be ready for that. They have to know that another person exists. You have these kids who are very egocentric, and they really don't recognize that another person has feelings, that another person has their own way of doing things. You can't have sharing without knowing that idea, that having that concept of not being egocentric. There might be some teaching and learning to do before that kid could be friends with anybody. So I would devote, and I think programs should be developed where that is the primary goal. Because the definition of real autism has to do with socialization. If we could establish, and I did this in my office privately, but if we could establish systematically, and that's a good suggestion for the school, a systematic approach to develop friendships, genuine friendships, mutual friendships, reciprocation, real friendships. If we could develop a way of doing that with these kids, what does that mean? They're not as autistic anymore, because that's part of the definition. We're going to establish something that's going to change that, real genuine friendships. I think that may be the most important thing to do.
Thank you. Now I will take actually the questions which has already been set and ask the first question to Anisha. Is there a way to detect Fragile X during pregnancy? Essentially, is there a prenatal test?
Yes,
or?
there is a prenatal test, yes.
Okay. Can you tell us a bit about testing? Because I think Shalini, what are the logistics of testing? How much does it cost? And what can need?
Sure. So in India, there are many centers which do this test. It's a blood test. The information for this can be found on fragilex.in. Typically, it's a blood test, and it would cost you in the range of about 7,000 rupees. And there are many places in India who do this test, and one of the most recommended is CCMB in Hyderabad.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Sufi, I have given you the question. Can you please read it out and then...
The question is, since you have worked in both the rural and urban sectors, What, in your opinion, is the biggest difference with regards to the level of awareness and the work done towards empowerment of the persons with disabilities? In short, I would like to say that in this I was concerned mainly with this subcontinent. In this subcontinent, still the old indigenous family system is prevailing, though reduced. We are coming to smaller families, turning towards smaller families, and the old taste of the grandfathers, grandmothers, uncles, and aunts in the same courtyard is gradually reducing. When we had this system in the Indian subcontinent and then the neighboring countries, and we found that the persons with disabilities were in the comfort and in the warmth of the whole family members. Naturally, the awareness among the siblings, cousins were more, which is reducing. But the thing is, in this subcontinent, there are invisible governments, the local governments, still prevailing, which is much above the central government. In my country, as well as in India, I know that there are many villages where the headmen of the villages and the village local body, whatever they decides, is more powerful decisions than the central governments of India's decision or in the Bangladesh government's decision. The whole village will do whatever the headman says, and the panchayat, the family, village tribal leaders, they decide, and that happens. Awareness, to me, awareness is more towards the persons with disabilities in the rural areas compared to the urban areas. But the I mentioned in my lecture that the sufferings are more among the urban middle-class families, parents of the middle-class families. The rich people, they can undertake many programs, especially for their children. And the poor people, they do not bother to undertake any program, natural grooming. And the middle class, the children are not allowed in the at opposite door neighbor, and that is a big problem. Anyway, I believe that the visits of the professionals, the concerned persons, important peoples, if they frequently visit the houses and if the media, this strongest role can be played by the mass media. If they can continue to make the awareness, the whole situation will be changed. And that's
Thank you.
Summary at this moment.
Thank you. Shereen, you have got a question. Can you just please read it out and then...
The question is, there are a few children who eat all kinds of food, different types and texture, but still find difficulty in speech. So what would you do in this area? Just because a child has does not have, or rather there's no, how would I put it? It's not necessary that a child has to have a feeding issue for speech clarity to get affected. Right? They could have no feeding issues at all, that's not a problem, and still have their speech affected. And that does happen. So if it was their speech that's affected, you would work on, again, the same motor movements that are needed for those speech sounds. It's the same concept. If it is feeding affected, you'd work on that too. If it is only speech that's affected, that you would work on that. So it kind of depends on what is affected, and those are the motor movements you would work on using the same tools that I showed in the presentation.
Thank you. Julie, you have got a question? Yeah.
So the question was, what method, which was already asked, and how do you connect the brain and body? I wanted to touch on method a little bit more. I use the term assistive technology because it's a very broad term, and the acronym that we have for that is AT. And then how do you connect the brain and body? So many steps that we can have for this. I use a lot of prompting. I also speak to the brain very differently from how I speak to the body. So I will reassure the child, who the child is on the inside, and say, I know you want to do more, and I'm going to help you do more. But then the body might freak out, right? So you have to find this balance between the brain and the body. And so when I'm speaking to the body, I give much more clear prompts, telling them one movement to do at a time. Just saying, if you're working on potty training, just saying, go to the bathroom. There's 50 or way more motor steps that are involved in going to the bathroom, right? Just turning your body and orienting it towards the direction you need to go is one step. And you might have to do that step multiple times. So breaking down the prompts for the body, and working on movement, working on purposefulness. So just even, any sort of movement skill. Here, hold this glass, right? Now it becomes purposeful because I've asked you to do something. And they get to work on getting their body to listen to what you're wanting it to do, what they're wanting it to do. Does that answer? I don't know, okay.
Okay, thanks. Next question again, Anisha, regarding fragile X. There is an interesting actually question. The question is that individuals differ in looks and personality. So is there a more concrete way of identifying fragile X apart from a formal genetic test? So I think what the question is trying to get is, can you not do a genetic test?
And look at the features. But ideally you would want to do the genetic test because that's the best way to kind of know for sure whether the child has it or not, because you do have things like features. In terms of the features, you have, like Shalini had explained, you have longer ears, and your hands flap, and you have longer faces. But then if you are in doubt, then the best thing to do is just do the test.
And also I think the question is, if we leave it to the, in my own clinical experience, if I have asked this question to the parents, it's best to let them decide, because often I'm not very clear from the facial expression or from the body morphology whether the child has fragile X or not. So it's best to leave it to the person or the family to decide whether we should want to go ahead rather than us deciding it, isn't it? That's what I felt. Dr. Bernstein, another question for you, please. You mentioned in your session that you are trying to teach the underlying concepts and take the cognitive path. So how do you teach the kids who have difficulty in understanding or comprehending language?
Understanding.
And comprehending language.
Okay. First thing, it's a philosophical kind of thing. Where does language come from? I feel language comes from concepts. A behavioral approach may differ. They may say language is language, speech is speech. The kid says, Mommy. I like this example because it's actually from Lois Bloom at Columbia University. Kid says Mommy, learns Mommy. Kid says sweater. Says sweater. Mommy sweater. He's saying the word mommy, saying the word sweater, and he says mommy sweater, he's saying two words. From a cognitive point of view, I would say, in effect, no, it's not what's happening. The kid has the underlying concept of possession. I can't measure it, I can prove that. I can't say that's evidence-based, I can't. The possession, mommy sweater, the sweater belongs to mommy. So if you believe that language comes from concepts, so if you have a child who doesn't talk, and he's dragging you to the refrigerator to get some food, I'm saying he has that underlying concept of all kinds of things. He's hungry, he wants to drink. There's a whole language there that he's not using. And you start with that. You start with what he does understand in a nonverbal way. And you can see if you came to my talk, sometimes what I'll do, I'll put the words in the kid's mouth. What the kid is really saying is, Mommy, come here. Mommy, so I try to attach language to what the kid is doing, because some kids are not attached to language. They don't have a concept of language. They don't connect. You could speak in an entirely different language to them, it doesn't matter. So they don't have the idea that language is used to communicate, period. A lot of kids are like that. So we have to actually teach language means something, makes their life easier by, one suggestion, is see what they do know, see what concept they do have. They do want something, and see if we could attach language to that.
And if I just augment on that, I think at some level, all children, however severe the disability is, has got an understanding of language. You know, as Julie said, there is a cognitive part to it. So we have to be evaluating the level at which the child is, and every children has some understanding, and then take it up from there and gradually build the processes which you mentioned. The other thing which I wanted actually to ask, it's a personal question to Julie, and I think it is very important for all of us therapists, doctors, professionals, regarding children or even with adults who are on the spectrum or have retardation or developmental disorder, is this presumption of incompetence or non-competence. I think something which you mentioned, that we presume that the child does not have the competence to understand, and therefore we take a lot of things for granted. Can you just highlight on how we can, educate carers, parents, people like us, that presumption of non-competence is actually a dangerous thing?
Yes, yes. And I think by having this conference right here, we are doing it, right? And all the work that you guys are doing are making huge steps towards that. But it is so important to presume competence. If we don't, we're aiming low, and they are only going to reach up to where we present, right? So I have an example. This family I started working with recently has been working on potty training for years. She's 9 years old. And they, had not been presuming competence because that's what it looks like, right? It looks like she's not paying attention. It looks like it's not going in. And so they spoke to her in that way. And then I was there, I went to their house for a weekend, and they saw a whole other way to speak to her. I spoke to her like she's any other 9-year-old, and talked to her like she's a 9-year-old. I fed her brain, I gave her information. And after I left, I didn't do anything with potty training, but after I left, she went and peed on the toilet by herself, and has been so consistently going to that toilet over and over and over. And her parents said, I think it's really because you spoke to her in the way that she wanted, that it needed to be spoken to. And so the danger of not presuming competence is that we're going to be aiming low, and our kids need us to aim high.
Thank you. I think we have, yeah.
Can I get
Yeah.
2 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
I mentioned few of the hopes. Number one, the Chinese genetic engineers, they have already helped give birth of a twin who will not have AIDS. The genetic engineers have done so much of their advancement that these twins will never have the AIDS. It is a 2 weeks back report. Number one, one of my personal experience, I was working in the Oslo University Genetic Engineering Lab. I found a baby living. He was few months old, and he had this, it was a he baby, and this baby was alive. It has monosomy in the number 19 or in Oslo University Genetic Engineering Lab. I was working with Dr. Else Maria Spetalon, and she showed me under the electron microscope, that this baby was having one chromosome instead of 2 chromosomes in the pair. but the baby was alive. There is a mystery. So one is an invention already done by the Chinese genetic engineer. One is I have seen by my own eyes. Number 3, when I was the director of the National Center for Special Education and the Disabled in Bangladesh, I met 2 guys. Both were adult with autistic symptoms. They could not calculate how much will be the result when 2 is deducted from 15. This simple mathematics they cannot do, but both of them, one was a boy and man, one is a woman, they could answer many complicated mathematical calculations. Like what was the day in the year 1947 on certain day. But that is a higher mathematics they can do. So we are in the world of a mystery yet. And also we are in the verge of many scientific developments.
Thank you.
Sorry for giving.
Yeah. I think we will have couple of more questions which are already there. Shereen, if you can just, and then I think a couple of more for Julie. You have got one more? Yeah.
The first question is, a child who's 6 to 8 years can say vowels. What should be the next step? Well, technically, if you go by the development, the normal development of sounds, and that's how OPT also kind of does things, the next movement would be, vowels are all your where you open up your jaw. So then it would work on the next, which is closing the jaw and closing the lips, which will be your per, b, and m. Those would be the next set of sounds we would work on. And then we'd work on rounding, which would be oo and o, and so on and so forth. So it's a step-by-step process. I cannot go through the entire set, but if, according to the question, the next would be per, b, m, which you would try and work on. How do you address the problems when a child is eating non-edible stuff? You have to understand why the child is doing that. There is a lot of seeking that he's doing. So if that's the case, the sensory system needs to be addressed, and you need to be able to give him input so that he does not seek non-edible stuff. So that's one of the things you can do to give them more input, and it can be done in a variety of ways, whether it's giving him the chewy tube or harder textured food to eat, more sensory breaks that give him that kind of input, sucking thick liquids through a straw. A lot of this give proprioceptive feedback, which calm the TMJ or the temporomandibular joint, which prevents, which rather stops them from wanting to seek more.
I just want to add something with the bubble example. When a child says one single word, tons of them, bubbles, cat, dog, and all that, that's an associative kind of thing. It's more perceptual that they see rather than conceptual as an underlying idea or concept. In other words, if I ask you to draw a picture of an apple, you'll all do something like that. But then I say, draw food. The first thing you go is, what do you mean food? I mean, it's a concept, and you can't draw a concept. It's something underlying. So you have these words like bubble and cat or whatever, and I'm saying there's a huge jump between bubbles and combining 2 words. Let's call it syntax, grammar. When you combine 2 words like dog eating, I gave you the example of mommy sweater, there's a story behind it. There's an underlying idea or concept. It just so happens, and I'm just throwing this out there, at that point when a kid combines words and develops conceptually, that's the point where, and I've never said this publicly before, that's the point where a lot of kids who develop normally stop. 15, 18 months, about 20 months, 2 years. Kids develop normally, and then all of a sudden, like a switch, they're autistic and no language. It just happens to be at that same point, that the one word, and then when there's 2 words and that underlying concept comes into play, it fails. So what I'm saying as the next broad step to a word like bubbles is see if the child can combine that or combine 2 words together which is normally happens when? Generally 1 word in 1 year, generally 2 words in 2 years. That's the critical time that we need to impose on these kids on the spectrum.
Thank you. 2 last questions, one finally for Julie and then one for Anisha. Yeah,
Okay,
thanks.
great. Has severity of autism got anything to do with the kid's success on using the letterboards? Is there any prerequisite skills required to use the letterboard? And if yes, then what are the prereq skills? So, severity of autism, great question. Basically, we've got kids who are non-speaking and kids who are speaking, right? So non-speaking is pretty evident what that is. Speaking, we've got minimal speakers. We've also got this subset I had never heard of before until this whole world opened up to me, which is unreliable speakers, right? And then we have kids who speak a ton. So most of the clients that I work with on the letterboards are either non-speaking or minimally speaking or unreliably speaking. I have no clue if those who have tons of speech are purposeful. It's a mystery, and so that's all untapped to me. So with severity, I think oftentimes we pair speech level with severity. And so I would say no limitations on, it's worth trying. It's worth trying for everybody in that non-minimally or unreliably speaking category. And then prereqs, the success, the motor skills are such a huge spectrum. I've got some kids who cannot hold a pencil and other kids who are so amazing with being able to do those motor skills. So I would say that if motor is a challenge with all of these kids, but that is something that you can work on in prepping them for success on the letterboard, is motor skills. And then any prerequisite skills, I don't think so. I'm trying to think of anything. I think motor work and presuming competence and feeding the brain and speaking to them, sharing stories with them. I think all of that helps add towards the success.
Thank you. I think the last one, this is quite an emotionally loaded question. Anisha has to brave this. You mentioned in your talk that the syndrome is passed on silently to the next child. So are you saying that a parent cannot go for a second issue, or is that the chances of the next child inheriting the syndrome is high?
So the chances of inheriting the syndrome is about 50%, which makes it very essential that you get some genetic counseling before you go for a second child, if you know that your first child is affected. Basically, when we say Fragile X, it's an X chromosomal related issue. So, as we know that the mother has 2 X chromosomes and she's going to pass on 1, and she could pass on the one which is affected, so which is why it's 50%. And if you know that the father was a carrier, then he has only 1 X chromosome to give. So in that case, it would be 100%. So it's very essential that if you already have a history of Fragile X, the first child, then do take that opinion from the genetic doctor and take that decision. It's essential for the second child.
Thank you. Yeah. I think people are getting restless, so if we finish,
Very shortly. In the year 1989, at the end of, almost at the end of 1990, one couple came to me and with the question. And in the year 1990, Bangladesh, we didn't have any amniocentesis clinic. So we could not give the mother, the parents, the decision whether they will proceed with the, baby. Then we went to the highest research institute. We had the highest high-level scientists to analyze the chromosome, but we didn't have the technicians to take the amniotic fluid. That was our problem. So we made a medical board and comprising the scientists from different disciplines, and what decision we gave, we asked the mother not to ride on the motorbike. And after that, I had to go back to my university since my term was completed. And I was very anxious that what will really happen if the second baby really is affected. Then from the university, I continued relation with them. And I found that until 2-3 years, it was not detected that the second child was affected. So it is not, I am not concluding. There are chances of 50-50.
I think genetic, yeah.
But I will strongly recommend that when a woman gets pregnancy, and she should avoid the motorbike.
That's sound advice, and particularly in streets in South Asia. Thank you, everyone. It has been a long day. Tomorrow would be even longer, so come prepared. I would like to thank all the speakers, and I make special thanks to Anisha. Really, we really, dragged her up in the stage, and a huge thank you to you, and applause for all the participants. Thank you.